Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Tim Bajarin. He is the chairman at Creative Strategies, Inc. And we just had a very, very interesting pre-conversation about his background. For those just listening in audio, he's got his old museum behind him, his computer museum, but it doesn't only include computers, it also includes a whole bunch of other technologies. And I'm so excited. I think you're the exact person that I want to talk to kind of get the foundation of what's going on, because it's obvious that you've been doing a lot of historical investigation. So not only the personal computing industry, which I thought we were going to talk about, but we're also going to talk about the whole history of technology, I guess. So welcome to the show, Tim.
Glad to be with you. Thank you.
So, okay, where do we start? Let's go back to the 1980s when you were first getting into this whole thing. Why did you get into it?
Well, two things. First of all, I joined Creative Strategies in 1981. And even though I had done some work in semiconductor beforehand, it was the first time I came into the market research world. And it was almost kind of a fluke. But because of IBM entering the PC market in 1981, my company, which at the time was owned by Business International, wanted a PC analyst. And it was asked if I would do that because I was actually one of the younger people at the time on the staff and was into technology and was, had gone to a lot of the early technology meetings around the Valley. And so I accepted the job to become actually became one of the first PC analysts that ever existed. There were only one or two others that popped up during the same time. The guy that started Forrester and one other guy. But basically, I had to kind of learn early how to be an analyst. And what forced me kind of to move into the PC experience so much is one of Business International's clients was IBM. And in 1981, they introduced the original IBM PC. And they asked, put a query into our company if there was someone there who could work with them on thinking through other PC products. And the first project I was given actually was, what do they do with PC Junior? And then after that, they brought me in to help with thinking through the actual strategy for both marketing and actual retail. And so I got thrown into the pool, and thankfully I had a marketing background and and a technology background, so it actually worked out well. And then because of that position, I was then acknowledged as a PC analyst, and was invited to come out to Compaq and sit down with Rod Canyon and the team there just after they introduced the original Compaq, the one that looked like a sewing machine, right? And so I went out and spent time with him and got indoctrinated, literally, not only on how Compaq started, but Rod Canyon's background, because he had come from Texas Instruments, and fundamentally then began as an analyst doing some research for Compaq. Then after that, I got to meet Michael Dell, and he had then popped up on the scene to start selling computers out of his car on the campus. And next thing you know, Dell becomes
UT Austin, right? Is that yeah?
Yeah, he becomes a major next company, and they were asked me to come and help some of the strategies with Dell, and we still work with Dell, and what is now Compaq now, of course, is now part of HP. The brand itself is gone, and because HP bought it and absorbed it. And at the same time, this is another odd one. When HP jumped in the game, because I was a PC analyst, they invited me to come over. And that was fascinating in two contexts. One, I was one of the first to see the original PC from HP, but they let me have a meeting with David Packard, and he was still, although he was not a acting CEO at the time.
Uh-huh.
He was still there. Actually, both him and Hewlett were still there. And that historically is fascinating because I got to see him in his office, which is now a historical landmark on the HP campus.
So,
So that kind of how I got into it.
and I imagine that that's probably where you started with this early history. So all the objects in the background, is that what started it when you went into this historical office? Did you know the historical legacy that was being
No,
written? Yeah,
it started before that
go
because
for it.
you know, I I actually came into the whole thing and I was thrown into the PC side and I had to learn. And once you start getting into this industry, you really have to think about how we got here, not where we're going. Now, granted, my job was to help them figure out where we were going, but you really needed to have good knowledge. And I happened to, before I was doing PCs, we were researching mini computers. So I'd already done a lot of work on reports for mini computers. And anyway, that triggered my thinking, okay, what was before the mini computer? Then we
Mm-hmm.
looked at the bigger computers. And then I started thinking about, wait a minute, what did come before supercomputers? And then I looked backwards. And when you really did that, you started to see all of the things that were done like in the late 1800s. And then I went all the way back to Gutenberg. And then I started tracking and saying, it really, to truly understand the industry, and this, by the way, is kind of a historical tenet, that you have to know the past
Yeah,
to predict the future.
yeah.
And so I built a knowledge base of technology from the past that I was then able to apply to my work with consulting with all of the big companies, both PC, CE, and telecom guys over the last 40 years to help them be more accurate in their thinking. Because again, if you know the past and understand the past, you have a better chance of understanding where you need to go in the future.
Which is so crazy because I'll go on a tangent. I want to go into what you just said, but I'll go on a tangent. It feels very crazy to me that there seems to be so little interest or curiosity in the past. Like a little bit with the show that I'm doing with my father, Stuart Squared, which is not this show because that's one we're doing together where I kind of go in and try to figure out what was his role and everything like that. And it feels like I'm just like a weird autist going off into the history and like nobody's really interested in it, but it feels so important. And so let's go into the 1880s. And I've been reading this two books, one called The Invention of News, which definitely goes into Gutenberg, but it also goes before Gutenberg of the networks of letter writers
Right.
that the finance guys would hire, and they were the first analysts in Italy, where they would analyze the markets and try to get the actual information. Misinformation was a huge problem back then. It's not like that's a new problem. And so then the Gutenberg comes out with the printing press, starts Protestantism, becomes the first sort of social media influencer of the 1500s, and then somehow I'm still unclear between that original technology of Gutenberg and then the 1800s, because it really feels like in the 1800s everything started to just like it
Well,
was like, yeah.
I think the big thing of the 1800s was the advancements in printing presses,
Interesting. Yeah.
because before that, most of that was, and in Gutenberg's case, it was a single workshop that he created this in. And the really big question was, how do you expand the workshops?
Mhm.
And thankfully, there were others out there who were willing to create around his creation.
Yeah.
And that was the thread. So it wasn't until the 1800s that we really, well, you actually got it in the late mid 1700s, but by
Uh-huh.
the early 1800s, the printing presses were pretty much everywhere in various sizes and shapes. And that goes to what I told you about this little this, and maybe we can bring it in here. This little, it's a handheld typewriter that actually has two things. It has a little button, a spinner on top, where you actually have to spin to the letter you want, and then you press it down to print it. And if you want to go to a capital, you press this up and the capital comes up.
Yeah.
But this goes back to this into again the late 1700s, because not only did you get the beginning of printing presses, you started to get little devices so somebody could do this. Now, granted, this was a painful experience if you had to do one letter at a time, much different than what the Gutenberg thing is. But that was the context of mobile, right? And that's why I said I think that the bigger thread, or the next big thread, was the invention of next level printing presses that then it was able to replicate Gutenberg's inventions to a much broader audience.
And how much of that is sort of the invention of all the ancillary technologies? Was it all ancillary technologies, or was it also processes in the same way that the 1980s was processes?
Yeah, it was part and parcel.
Yeah.
Once you had the devices, then you could start figuring out, all right, what do? You get the news, you get an editor, you set it up, and then you do the print. But and again, they were all, what I find fascinating about the historical part, they basically were they were inventing on the fly.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And that to me is one of the more amazing things. And by the way, that goes all the way to current stuff, is we're inventing always on the fly.
Yeah.
At one point, I did some significant work over at Xerox PARC when I served on their venture advisory board. And I got to talk with a lot of the guys who were creating products over there, because their goal was, create the next new thing.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating because these were guys that were given money just to play
around,
to figure out what's the next thing. And their job was not only to invent, but to actually figure out what the thing could do and the process to make it successful.
So how much did they know about the history?
Theory,
did they know much about the history?
Actually, they were pretty.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. They had historians on staff. I mean, they understood the background. Now, whether that's applicable to what these guys were doing at the time was, questionable.
Yeah.
Because at the same time, they created so many things that they didn't take advantage of.
Yeah.
Like the graphical interface and the mouse, etc. But I find them, and I consider them historically, one of the most important in carrying through the concept of invention and process.
Let's go into that, the GUI, because that's the famous where they invited Steve Jobs over, and then Steve Jobs basically took it and ran with it, right? What's your take on that story?
Yeah. Well, it's pretty true. I mean, that's the other thing about Xerox PARC in that particular time frame. They've gotten much better on this now, but nobody there even thought to patent it. And so I don't think Steve used the word stole.
Yeah.
I think he used the word borrow.
Borrow.
But basically, that introduced him to the graphical user interface. But again, think about the history that forced that. If you listen to the speech that Steve did at Stanford graduation, he talks about his infatuation with lettering.
Yeah.
And the specialty, lettering, etc. And words, right? And that all played into him willing to put money on a laser printer, for example, and then talk to John Warnock and use PostScript. And next thing you know, we had desktop publishing.
So,
right. And again, it was all process. Steve, and he was so brilliant. He put the pieces together and put the money into getting the Canon engine and doing the laser printer for Apple. Then he got in touch with a guy named Paul Brainerd, who created PageMaker. And then John Warnock started finding out about this. And then he went in and said, Steve, you can only do this if you actually give an actual structure to each letter going forward. And then which is, of course, PostScript. And
That
you put the three together, and next, with the Mac, because had the graphical interface, you ended up with desktop publishing.
and that was people with their PCs and their own printers. Now, this is so funny because
Well,
go for it.
Initially it was only the Mac, because only the Mac had the graphical structure. Yeah.
Yeah.
To support PostScript and PageMaker. And Paul Brainerd of Aldus, literally, when he saw PostScript, that was the first thing he did. Because he was a publisher. He was he was in a role of creation. And the first thing he did was, hey, I'll do a Mac version of what we're doing, which was a high-end software. We'll do a Mac version because the Mac could support the concept.
Got it.
And again, you married the things together: laser press, PageMaker, PostScript, and Allah. Desktop publishing, which fundamentally revolutionized the world of publishing.
And I was looking, and you predicted that. You saw that coming in a few years.
I did. I saw I predicted desktop publishing 2 years earlier because Canon let me see the engine they were creating. And understand, at the time they showed me this, laser printers were basically fit into a closet, and they were $50,000 to $100,000 a piece. And what Canon told me with that engine, because they made it so small, they believed that they could create a laser printer, under $10,000. And all I did was look at the logic. If a laser printer today is 50,000, and you can get it down to, let's say, 10,000, and this is where Steve Jobs jumps in, because his was 7,500, if you remember. But basically, then you understood that this is possibly a potentially big audience. And then the marriage of PageMaker and PostScript, etc., gets put together. And the funny part about that particular one is Jobs put it all together, but then he got fired in late 19.
And then he went off and
1985.
Yeah, and then he went off and did.
He did next. Yeah, but to John Scully's credit, he took that and he built an amazing campaign to drive desktop publishing, which is put Mac on the enterprise map.
Yeah. And then almost 10 years later, 12 years later, once that desktop publishing had kind of gone, had become part of the market and was no longer their strength, that's when they started to get into a sort of doldrum, where then Steve Jobs, and this is the part, what I've been thinking behind my head, is that Steve Jobs came back with Next. And Next had Unix operating system on it, a Unix-based operating system that turned into the Mac operating system, which is now really helping me out in my current coding stuff, because it's way more simple than what I remember in the Windows and all that's crazy. And so this, for my generation, I grew up, you guys were all tinkering with these real physical products. It wasn't abstract. It was all there. You could touch it and that was 200 years. And then when I started in 1985, I was born. 1995 I was getting into computer games pretty early, because my dad would always bring these computers home, and the only thing that I was interested in was the computer games. And then I started going to school and did word processing, but it was all software. It was all like inside of this thing that I didn't really understand, that was physical, but it didn't really matter that it was physical. And that just kept on progressing more and more until we get the internet and social networks and now AI, and it's all just in there. And I feel disconnected from it, but at the same time, all of my life is mediated through it in this way that feels really weird. Which you guys, I don't think, didn't get it. You didn't have that weirdness, or was it weird? That's a good question to ask you. Like what?
Well, it wasn't necessarily weird. It was new.
New. Yeah, it was novel.
because, before that, everybody, advertisers, graphics, they would have to go to a service
Yep.
to get their stuff done, right? But I want to just state that there was one other blip or positive blip that happened with Apple before they went into the doldrums. And
Yeah.
this is
Okay.
I still believe this is one of John Scully's other major big deals, is he introduced multimedia computing. What he did is he brought a CD-ROM to a Mac. And next thing you knew, you had the whole idea of mixed media as part of publishing. And then he did the
Got it.
CD-ROM and read write, and you ended up with a whole new thing. So starting in as literally as early as 1989, Apple began pioneering the concept of multimedia publishing, and that became full bore by 1992. And of course, at that point, Scully was asked to leave, and then you ended up with Spindler and others. And that's where the doldrum was, because they tried to be like everybody else. And one of the big mistakes Spindler did is he tried to make the Mac look like a PC, which, to us, we look back there, because the Mac itself was so unique in its own right. And so basically with what Spindler did, and then following CEO, Emilio, they drove Apple in a different direction. And that's why when Steve came back, he just said, screw it. And I'll tell you one little interesting note here. I met with Steve the second day he came back. And I asked him, I says, by the way, at that time, Apple was $1 billion in the red. They were, we now know historically, they were 6 to 8 weeks from possibly going bankrupt. And I asked Steve, what are you going to do to save Apple? And he gave me actually three, but two distinct answers. He said, number one, I'm going to go back and take care of the needs of my core customers, graphical artists, engineers. Those are the major customers that we lost and we need to bring back. But then he made a little side comment that was fascinating. He says, I'm going to focus on industrial design. And at that time, this was 1997, I thought, what the heck does that mean? But what he did, of course, in the next year is introduce the candy-colored iMacs.
Yeah.
And from that point on, the concept of innovation design to the PC changed the PC market completely. And instead of going into the 2000s with PCs that look like battleships, we started innovation in new industrial design, and Steve led the way with, in his case, Steve, using industrial design, set Apple on a really big path where industrial design now is a core of everything they do.
And this is so fascinating to me because without Steve Jobs, we can play the counterfactual. It would have just been bland IBM, like just pure efficiency, and efficiency, while interesting, is also extremely boring and removes us from the human element of computing. And it all goes back to the human. And without Steve Jobs, it would have just been a very, very boring, very
probably. Again, it's kind of speculative because they could have also maybe found a CEO that was also innovative. But
interesting.
Steve coming back to the company he founded, in which he had already skin in the game, I think forced Steve to be more disciplined. And it's funny because I've known Steve from early on. The Steve Jobs that was fired to the Steve Jobs that came back in 97 was a completely different guy. He was more mature. He was still, emotional and very reactive. But I thought he was much more mature. And he got married during that time. He had kids. And he came back as what I call a seasoned veteran of the computer wars, as opposed to what he was before 1984, when he and Woz in general were kind of, wading their way through the industry, just trying to figure out what to do.
Did he have a historical interest? I mean, of course he did. He definitely had a historical interest. What were some of the things you learned about the history from Steve Jobs?
Well, one was the whole issue of his fascination with lettering
Yeah.
and all the different ways of using ways of communicating. The other thing is Steve, once he understood that the graphical interface was important, that's how he helped the team drive the design to make sure it could take advantage of graphical design. So that the original Mac Paint followed all of the rules that Steve had in a part of the that he actually gave to the team to say, here's what I need in the OS to support, making a
Mm.
S exactly like it's supposed to be, right? Or a U exactly like it's supposed to be. And by doing that, because before that, remember, all of this stuff on the screens were basically an interpretation of ASCII characters.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But once Steve came in and introduced the graphical, all of a sudden we could actually stretch a letter. We could move the letter, and we could
Mm.
manipulate a letter. And that was
What?
dramatic. And that freaked so many people out.
And that was Mac Paint. Wait, so was that Mac Paint? And then also I want to go into the comment about
Mac
freaking
Paint.
people out. Okay, so it was Mac Paint that
Yeah,
all of a sudden
Mac Paint.
that allowed us to be on the screen with the mouse to basically change the shape of the letters so that we could create our own types. That's really interesting. And then
Right.
how did it freak people out?
Well, because they'd not seen it before. If you were, and again, if you came through the say 1980s, 1977 when the Apple II came out, and then the defining app that really put the Apple II on the Mac, which was VisiCalc,
Yeah.
you know that basically it was a tabulation product,
Uh-huh.
right? And yes, they did start doing early word processors and other things, but again, they were all static. The letters were the same, etc. It wasn't until Apple introduced the Mac and be able to manipulate the text and the images that there was a change. And if you lived in the PC world and you saw this, you're going, holy crap, what is this thing? And that's what got, like I said, that's why desktop publishing became such a big deal. And then, as you know, by the late 1980s, Microsoft jumps in with the first version of not only
Yeah.
Windows, what was originally Windows 95, or Windows, I guess, the first iteration of Windows, but they also started doing the exact same thing are under original DOS code that was no longer the core OS, but it was now a OS with graphical structure to match the Mac starting in late in 1989.
Graphical structure that matched the Mac. Yeah, they introduced their own GUI. And did that happen? Did that happen at the same time as they bundled together Microsoft Word, Excel, and all those different things, or did that come later?
About the same time.
About
They
the
actually
same time.
done some experimenting with the bundling before that.
Okay.
And then, of course, remember, Microsoft was under pressure too because Lotus 123 came out.
Yeah.
And Lotus
Yeah.
123 challenged them in the context of what they were doing with a spreadsheet by adding word processing and other management tools. So people were always, like, and Mitch Kapoor specifically at Lotus and his team were always, chomping at the bit to try to do Microsoft one better.
Yep.
And that kind of was forced them to do the integration of, what eventually became the Microsoft suite of products.
Very interesting. Okay, so let's go back further because you have a specific insight into publishing, which I find fascinating. And I've tried to talk and kind of investigate with my dad about what happened before he entered the scene. And what happened before he entered the scene was the whole Earth catalog in I believe 1960s, but it might have been 70s by that point, where Stuart
Esther
Brand,
Brand.
Yeah, it creates the whole Earth catalog, and it was this shift, a really interesting shift that only people inside the computer industry really know. That between the hippie generation of the 1960s and the 1970s, with the whole Earth catalog, like once the hippie thing kind of died out a little bit, some people were still in it, and so Stuart Brand basically networked them all together with his publishing thing. And I've been doing a lot of reading, and they were all on El Camino, in the places that I used to go get, food at when I was growing up. They were all publishing, doing these publishing and figuring out all these publishing. Can you talk more about your thoughts on how that led into the personal computing industry, and also how that the whole history of the publishing leads up to that?
Well, remember that what you ended up here was a central pool of geeks.
Yeah.
It's the only way to put it. Guys that were very interested in technology. And they were basically, if you looked at their degrees, they were all software engineers, hardware engineers, semiconductor engineers, etc. And they were not, as we historically now know,
Yeah.
as sociable as
Yeah.
someone that was educated in a different category.
Yeah.
But they found great camaraderie with people of the same mind. And that's what actually forced so much of what took place. So you ended with all of these specialty little clubs that ended up, and you would go to them and you would share ideas, and you would have group meetings of like-minded, etc. And that became powerful. And it started out with, maybe 20 or 30 people. But by the late 70s, early 80s, even by 83-ish or so, that had grown to thousands of these like-minded people meeting and sharing ideas and concepts. And all of them, in one way, had to figure out, how do you communicate what you're thinking?
Yeah.
Because at that point, all the way they communicated at this point was in text and literally on drawing boards, sketching out semiconductor designs, right? And at that point, they started thinking, well, how can we automate the process? How can we change the design structure? And they said, well, wait a minute, couldn't the PC be a tool? So the PC was, but again, and to some degree it was okay, because the PC did allow you to do straight lines and basic things. But you couldn't play what I call the what if game. And you needed more of a graphical structure when you're designing, if you're actually designing stuff.
Yeah.
And that's where, we think of desktop publishing being mainly just used for publishing, but it made a huge impact on people who were designing manuals or schematics or whatever, because they could be much more, not only experimental, but expressive in how they communicated. And that's really the whole idea. All these little groups of like-minded people I consider the backbone of Silicon Valley. They're the ones who forced the issue going forward. Now, it was Steve Jobs who became the opportunist, as was Andy Grove and the guys at Intel and Gordon Moore, etc., because they put feet and structure to all of these little combination of meetings.
And this goes back. There's two things that go back all the way to the invention of what we're talking about with Gutenberg, which is that that's the way that it's been going since the 1500s. Is that people have been networking together based on language, asynchronously using letters. Then the printing press came out, and all of a sudden now you could create the same copy of the same material and get it out there to everyone. So that was like a sort of networking thing, and then you have the same thing what you just mentioned about Andy Grove, what he did to this sort of nascent industry of geeks, formalized, standardized, operationalized in the same way that it took 200 to 300 years, which you mentioned in the printing press, but did it all very quickly. I forgot the other right. Trade there. So what's your take on this? Like, what happened in the 1500s Why did this all happen? And how does it relate to that early PC industry?
Well, again, if you look at the history of Gutenberg, what it did is it brought knowledge to the masses.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because before that, everything was done by scribes, and the scribes would then teach. So you had millions of people who could only learn from an individual, and that individual is the one who was taught by, in those cases, was mostly the church, and that controlled the message. Whereas once the printing press kicked in, then you had an automated process of creating new knowledge, right? In this case, it was book. It started out as books, and because the first one was the Bible, but or Gutenberg's Bible, I should say, is one of them, because he did other things too, but that's the most famous one. But it did open the door to bring knowledge to the masses, and that's where the historical thing was. But at that point, of course, it also created a lot of new issues. It included heresy and et cetera. Some of the stuff we're going through right now, as a matter of fact.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Because all of a sudden the knowledge was spread,
Yes.
and people were getting smarter, and not just following, what was, fed to them.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
the one thing about humans in general, is that they're embedded, they have intelligence. And when they apply intelligence to knowledge, they can come up with their own conclusions. And that was the most
Dangerous.
dramatic shift. Yeah, that was the most dramatic shift. And of course, that's why the church got so upset about everything that was going on, and they tried as try to
Shut it all down.
control
Yeah.
knowledge. Yeah, even more so. Yeah.
Okay, so in this brilliant entry point into the next question, which is reflected in the back of your screen, because you have all sorts of communication methods. The one near the top of your head, I'll explain it for the listeners, is some sort of thing that transmits voice or music. And this is so interesting because for the printing press, all of a sudden, as you mentioned, we have knowledge being consumed by the masses, knowledge being written with the intention of spreading it to the masses rather than this one-to-one kind of thing that was before. Now we have a one-to-many, and people would read these things, and usually on a set time frame, and you didn't have to read it together, but everybody was getting it at the same time. And then all of a sudden the radio was invented. And now all of a sudden one person could broadcast their voice to a whole bunch of people, a little bit like what we're doing with this podcasting, except without a whole bunch of people. But one person could reach millions with their voice, but you would have to be there at the same time, which is a little bit different from what we've got going on now, where time has been a little bit changed by that nature. Now we can all consume what we want to consume at the time that's most convenient to us. But before, it was like a group process where people would sit down and listen to the radio, listen to Franklin Delano Roosevelt give his speech, listen to Churchill talk about what the Germans were doing. And so that is really interesting. And I'd like to understand what you think happened with the radio, if you have any interesting tidbits about historical.
Well, it goes,
Yeah.
that would take like three or
3
4
hours.
hours. But if you look back at the history of radio signals, you get an understanding of that. One of the things I mentioned to you in our pre-discussion, as I went to Oxford and took a class specifically on the history of British technology. And it went back, and of course it focused on all of the work was done on the British historical societies and their technical gurus, etc., that basically drove everything that was going on. But from that came things like the original clock that was so critical for navigation, or timepiece that was critical for navigation. And then in the 1800s, we started to see advancements that actually have their roots again in some of the British technologies for radio signals. And then you have over that time frame, it goes even further. And then where it really expanded, and by the way, all of the radio stuff came out of work that was done in relationship to World War I and World War II more than anything, because then it became part of not only what they were doing with radiology, et cetera, but for also for things for navigation, for communications, et cetera. And I have to admit, before I went to take this class at Oxford, I was thinking everything, was invented here in California, at Stanford and, back at in MIT, et cetera. Was so shocked at how much stuff came out of the British Society, the group who were pioneering a lot of stuff, which by the way was the first click
Yeah.
of tech
Uh-huh.
thinking, right?
Uh-huh.
And that accelerated, and by the 1800s they started getting into the radio signals and the audio signals, and by the early 1900s, we had, as you mentioned, the things like the radios that we listened to, that eventually by the 50s we're into, 40s we got into the televisions, but it all has roots in the inventions and the works that was going on communication signaling, and so much of it can be traced back to what
Mhm.
was developed, especially in the 1800s in the UK. And of course, at the same time, it was being done out of things like Stanford and in the Boston
Okay.
area, et
Yeah.
cetera, who were trying to do exactly the same things that was going on. And then, of course, in World War II, they actually merged together because they were working together in order to defeat Hitler and what was going on in the World War II arena, especially in Europe at the time.
Okay, very interesting. For the last 5 to 10 minutes, let's go into that 1800s. Is it the Royal Society? Is that who you're talking about, the Royal
Yeah, Royal
Society?
Society.
And was it based in London? Can you talk more about, particularly in,
Well,
yeah,
it
yeah,
it was actually it was based in London as the headquarters, but they had outposts, especially because they were drawing mainly from scholars in Oxford and Cambridge.
okay, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
they were the core, but then you had all of these guys like Harrison, who literally created the first clock that could do second to second timing. And he was not a part of the Royal Society, but because of his invention, he became part of the Royal Society. So you always had these little guys on the periphery
yeah.
who were doing some kind of invention, who would put it in front of the Royal Society. And if the Royal Society deemed it worthy, they would then do the research on it, started doing to see if it made sense. And then in the case of Harrison and his original clock, um, that once they realized he had nailed it so that it could be used especially for navigation, then he became part of the Royal Society.
This is all very good. Okay, last question. Does in the 1980s, when you had the clicks inside of the PC industry, or late 70s, were they aware of how similar it all seemed to the Royal Society in the way that the Royal Society in
No,
Cambridge and Oxford? No.
some of them did.
Yeah.
No, believe it or not, and again, I don't know if this was actually taught in the engineering schools per se, but if any of them were really interested in historical stuff, you would have always gone back to the Royal Society.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then if you were really doing it, you were going back to Gutenberg in 1500s.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'll kind of put a bow on what we've talked about here, and something we talked about, in our pre. The reason I got so interested in history is my job as an analyst is to not only look at what we're doing today, but to try to look forward, to forecast what we're going to do. And I was always intrigued by the concept or the thought, in order to predict the future, you have to know the past. And that challenged me to start thinking about, okay, I came in and got thrown into the PC industry in 1981, even though I had been already involved with the mini computer side in research. And to some degree in the early 70s, I was involved with some semiconductor stuff. But at that time I was just, here's the technology, where do we go now?
Yeah.
But it became very clear to me, especially from the standpoint of where I took on a role of trying to forecast future thoughts or future technology or future direction. I couldn't do that without a significant grounding in the history of technology. And I started actually mostly around the Royal Society and what was going on in the 1800s, mid to 1800s in the UK. But that then pushed me back to Gutenberg, and especially when the desktop publishing came in, because I was really pleased I get to know John Warnock. In fact, he and I would always talk about book collecting. He was one of the avid book collectors of first editions. And he invited me over to his house at one point to go and see his collection. And to my dismay, I just couldn't fit the time in, and I didn't do it. It's one of the regrets I have in my life, because he actually had one of the Gutenberg Bibles. And I wanted to go to so anyway, and he's the one who also said, you've got to understand this historical printing, the history of printing, in order to kind of understand what's going on here. And that got me going back onto the Gutenberg stuff. And this was 1982 and 1983. But I will say that as fascinating as where we are today, how we got here is just as fascinating.
It's so fascinating. It's so fascinating. There's so many twists and turns, and there's all these patterns that seem to repeat themselves, but then new technology comes and just blows it all out of the water. And like all the things on the back of your on the screen right now, all that, nobody remembers any of those things, but they were all foundational pieces to how we got here. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you actually look closely at my museum, and I'd say I'll come to the side just a bit, but I also have not only old stuff, but I have all the different devices that I kind of worked on. You know, the original pocket computer, the original Macs are on there. I have almost every major early edition of things that was introduced, including the original Palm Pilot, the Apple Pad. I have tons of mobile devices, because from about 1991 to about 2005, I spent a lot of time helping companies create mobile computers for the future. So I have my hands on a lot of them. So a lot of those things are things that I actually worked on.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And how can people find out more about what you're working on and what you're doing?
Well, two things. I mean, if you want to find out more about our company, our website's creativestrategies.com. And then I write a column for Forbes usually comes out every Tuesday morning, where I write about current industry trends and things that are going forward. And every once in a while, I talk about my future thinking, but I'm mostly reporting on key events that are impacting the industry.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much.
All right.